Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this evening's Regional History Colloquium with architect Greg Scott. I will encourage you to use the Q&A function, usually at the bottom of your screen, to pose questions for this evening's speaker. Once Mr. Scott has concluded his formal remarks, we'll attempt to get to as many of those questions as we can. It is a pleasure to welcome back Greg Scott. Gregory J. Scott is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, partner emeritus at RLPS Architects, a columnist for LNP News, and twice recipient of the Smedley Award presented by the Historic Preservation Trust of Lancaster County. Greg previously presented about Cassius Emlen Urban at Lancaster History in 2018 to a sold-out crowd, and more recently presented the life and works of architect James H. Warner. In his most recent article in LNP, when writing about the Tudor revival style, he stated, "It never grows old, seemingly never falls out of favor. Its charm and allure appear to be timeless." The same can be said of our speaker tonight.
Oh, Tom, really?
He never grows old or falls out of favor. His charm and allure appear to be timeless. I give you Greg Scott, who will speak on C. Emlen Urban, Lost and Found. Greg?
Well, Tom, you were just too darn cute. What I'm going to try to do, thank you for that introduction. I am going to stop my video and launch my share screen and see if we can do this. So the question I'm asked over and over and over is, are you doing a book and when will it be available? And the answer is yes. We are in the process of doing a book right now, and it's going to be called Urban Legend, The Life and Legacy of C. Emlen Urban. And I'm working with a wonderful photographer from Lancaster, Matthew Tennyson. And Matthew is going to be showing you examples of C. Emlen Urban's work through his lens in ways you've never seen it before. As an example, this is actually the Grice building. I've never seen it look this beautiful before, but he is able to capture the magic of that building. So our book will include amazing photography. We're also going to include actual C. Emlen Urban drawings. We're thinking to include actual ink on linen, which is the style and material that he used when he was doing his drawings. We're also going to show you details of buildings on the exterior, as well as details of the buildings on the interior. A lot of these interiors are not open to the general public, so these will be an extra treat for everyone to enjoy. Every building that we highlight in the book will also have a narrative written about it, so that we include the name of the building, the address, the year, the style of the building, and also a story about not just the architecture, but about the people that retained C. Emlen Urban to design their building. Now, my young associates, Matthew Tennyson and Nate Murray, who I'm working with in graphic design, have said, well, it has to definitely include a QR code so that we can let the readers identify where the building is via maps and also additional information about the building. So we're looking forward to launching this and having it available next year at this time, just in time for the holidays. So let's get back on track with our show tonight. So what we're doing is breaking our talk down into 3 segments: Rising Star, Research, and Results. We're going to start with Rising Star, just giving you some background about C. Emlen Urban. Where was he born? Where did he live? What was his parents do? Where did he go to school? And so forth and so on. And then we're going to move into the research and then the results. So he was actually born in Conestoga, Pennsylvania, in the home of Amos Benedict, which is very curious, and that's a story for another day. His given name is Cassius Emlen Urban. Curiously, he never used Cassius in any of his writings, any of his signatures, any of his advertisements. He was always C. Emlen Urban. And he was born February 20th, 1863. So that's about 5 months prior to the Battle of Gettysburg. just to give you a context of history as to when Mr. Urban was born. And his parents were Amos and Barbara. And what's interesting, his father, Amos, was a carpenter by trade and also a partner in the firm of Urban Burger Planing Mill in Lancaster City. He was a very successful business person. He was also a soldier in the Civil War. He was actually a musician in Company D of the 195th Pennsylvania Infantry. Likewise, Amos's brother, Benjamin F.W. Urban, was also in the Civil War with him, and he was an author as well as a very well-known physician in the city of Lancaster. And C. Emlen Urban also had another uncle, John W. Urban, who was very renowned. He wrote a book called Battlefield about his days that he spent in prison during the Civil War. As the war was winding down, Amos and Barbara married and moved to the 500 block of South Queen Street in this little 2-story brick dwelling that is still there today. And C. Emlen moved into that house with his 3 sisters and his 1 brother, Christian. They lived there for 16 years. In the year 1880, his father, Amos, built the house in red. And interestingly, his brother, Benjamin, built the house in gray. So they're very compatible side-by-side homes built in the year 1880. We think or suspect these were homes from a catalog, but we also suspect that C. Emlen Urban also did some tweaks on the floor plans and the exterior elevations. It was also in this year that he graduated from the Lancaster Boys High School. He graduated on June 28, 1880. He graduated as the valedictorian of his class, which is pretty amazing. And he was able to address his classmates, his faculty, and the school directors with a very sophisticated school address, which you can find online if you want to Google it. Now, unlike other students of his caliber and his ability, he elected not to go to a university to further his education in architecture. Instead, he elected to go to Scranton, Pennsylvania, and do an apprenticeship with Edwin L. Walter from the year 1880 for 18 months. And then it's where he met Willis Gaylord Hale. He met Mr. Hale in Scranton, and Mr. Hale was from Philadelphia. So he followed Mr. Hale back to Philadelphia, and he finished his apprenticing with Mr. Hale for another 30 months. So all total, he had 48 months of apprenticing as an architect from a high school diploma. And in the year 1884, he had the courage and the moxie to hang a shingle at the age of 21 and practice architecture in his hometown. We do know that his first office was actually in his father's planing mill. Probably on the 2nd floor, his father gave him a place to set up a drawing board and start his young and early brilliant career. We found a newspaper clipping on October 10th, 1885. He was 23 years old at the time, and the newspaper clipping indicated that at that time, at that age of 23, he had already designed over 150 buildings. Now, we all know the newspaper never tells a lie, but that to me is absolutely incredible. 150 buildings by the time he was 23 years old. He was certainly not shy about advertising his abilities and his career and his vocation. Large print, C. Emlen Urban, architect. What's really fascinating, this was not planned for this evening, but exactly 135 years ago to the day, to today, he and Jenny Olivia were married at the St. Paul's Methodist Episcopal Church on South Queen Street. What a curiosity. So happy anniversary to Mr. Urban and Jenny. So as soon as they were married, they took residency in the 141 East New Street, that red brick building in the middle of the slide. And that is where they gave birth to their two children, their only two children, Miriam and Rathfon. And yes, that is Mr. Urban's motorcycle on the sidewalk. Now they lived there for 10 years, and I'm pretty sure that he put that third floor addition on there. It's the only third floor addition on the entire block. And then in the year 1896, he moved his family to 212 East King Street. And he was commissioned, he didn't own this house, he was commissioned to reclad the house in a new look. And this was his first venture into a Beaux-Arts style of architecture. So he and his family lived in the right-hand side of this duplex. And they lived there until the year 1914, when he and his family then moved out to Buchanan Park in this beautiful 5-bay stately colonial revival dwelling that he designed. What I found interesting is that when they finally moved there, he was 51 years old till he designed his first house for himself, and his kids were in their 20s. So they probably didn't even live there in that large estate when they finally got to move there. The second part is the research. When we started doing research on Mr. Urban, it was really in the year 2017. And at that time, his name was associated with 96 commissions. And those 96 commissions at that time were sprinkled between Lancaster and Hershey. And the information on those commissions was gleaned from pamphlets, brochures, and booklets that were produced by the Preservation Trust in the year 2009 and in the year 2010. And those publications included some very comprehensive directories of his work, including the year of the building, the name of the building, the address and location. But we also noticed that in that directory, there were a lot of projects that had question marks after them, meaning, was he the architect? Was he really attributed to it? Could it be his work or not? So it was those question marks that really gave rise to literally wanting to dig in and find out what's really going on with this Mr. Urban. And that newspaper story haunted me where it said he did 150 projects by the time he was 23. So if it wasn't without these entities on the screen right now, this would be a very short conversation tonight. I don't know where I'd be without Lancaster History and all of their wealth of information they have literally buried out there, and specifically the help that I've gotten from Marianne Heckles, the photo archivist. I'm sure she's glad that this session is now over this evening. And also Lancaster newspapers opened their archives in 2019 to the general public. That was a windfall and an avalanche of access to information for us, and specifically for Deb Osh. Deb Osh is my research historian. I don't know where I would be without all of her hard work and diligence in helping me do all of this. And lastly, residents. I get phone calls, emails, letters from residents putting me on to leads about Urban's work. So thank you everyone for all of that. So getting back to where we were in 2017, this is the 96 commissions. Where are we today, 4 years later, with doing all of this research and all of this digging? Well, his commissions went from a paltry 96, which is not paltry, by the way, 96. It is now ballooned to over 441 commissions that are absolutely rock solid, guaranteed his work through all the research that we've done. That is unparalleled, and we're still getting and finding more commissions. And through that research, we've identified that he worked in 57 building types, 57 types of buildings, anywhere from a skyscraper, of course, the Grice building, all the way to a cow barn of all things. I mean, that is quite a diversity of a portfolio when you think about the span that he was able to accomplish. Not only did he work in 57 building types, but he also worked in 21 different styles of architecture, as you can see highlighted on the screen. That is unparalleled. That is not unlike speaking 21 different languages, because every style has its own kit of parts, its own style characteristics, materials, and so forth. So quite honestly, where we are today, I can honestly say, ladies and gentlemen, look left, look right, look behind you, and look in front of you. Chances are, if you're not living in a Emlen Urban building, you're real close to one. I am just continued to be amazed at his diversity and of his work. Now, yes, we are always familiar with the ones that have been highlighted over recent years that he's done, and that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. We're not here to talk about Southern Market. We know he was 25 when he designed that, which is unheard of. We know also that that building lived a great grand life as our farmers market for many, many, many decades. And here it's highlighted in the year 1913 with all the farmers stands. And of course, it went through a transition when it was not a market, but we're real happy to announce this evening that is going through a renaissance, is returning back to an active market for food. I think Mr. Urban would be doing pirouettes if he was on this call this evening. So hats off to Willow Valley for making all of that happen. We all know about the Grice building, of course, the first skyscraper in our city in Italian Renaissance. We know about Watton Shand's department store and Beaux-Arts. We know about the Stevens School, one of my favorite projects, by the way, particularly on an end of day evening walk out the west side of town, and you see the sun glowing on that school is just absolutely spectacular. And of course, who doesn't know the Watt Mansion at the intersection of Marietta and President Avenue? Not just the mansion, but the gorgeous carriage house that complements it. We know about all those projects. Those are the ones that we've been focused on. But the curiosity is, what is in that bubble? What's inside that egg? And that's what we're going to have fun with now. We want to look at the results of the research and try to roll through about 20 of these kind of curious commissions that he did as part of his illustrious career. We're going to start first with one of my favorites, which is the General Tire Company. There is this drop-dead gorgeous service station, if you can believe, that he designed in the year 1930 at the age of 67. It sat at the point where West King meets West Orange. They come to a really sharp triangle, still there today. And on that sharp point, Mr. Urban planted this spectacular Spanish Revival service station, unparalleled from the ones I've seen other locations in our country. What I found curious, however, was prior to the service station sitting there, there was a private residence. And that private residence was the George Remley residence, actually called the Steamboat House, built in 1841. And I found it very curious that the Steamboat House and the service station have the same round turret type structure kind of centering the building. So we actually have the pen on ink or ink on linen drawings in our possession of that service station. As you can see illustrated here, Mr. Urban had a fine, sharp pen and was very proud of the work that they were able to draw. And then when you look at the photographs that we got out of the museum archives, you can see the attention that Mr. Urban put even on a gas station. The attention to the chevrons, which are baked terracotta glazed tile components, and the word lubritorium in raised lettering is just second to none. And he did this at the age of 67, nearing the end of his career. Now, we all know what sits there on the site today. It's a far cry from what Mr. Urban did in the year 1930. We also found that he did some work at Rocky Springs. I was always curious as to whether or not he did work at Rocky Springs. We all know about the roller coaster, but in the year 1903, we found a newspaper clipping that said, we're having the grand opening of a summer theater that will seat over 2,000 people. That is far bigger than the Fulton Opera House. 2,000 people in the summer theater. And here's what it looked like. This photograph is from the archives. He was 40 years old when he designed his Greek Revival theater in a very simple but very polite to the site taking advantage of the steep sights that are down at Rocky Springs to provide everyone in the audience with clear sight lines to the entertainment that was going on. Did he do a cow barn? Well, yes, actually, he designed a cow stable for Milton S. Hershey in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And what's interesting is it was designed to be 106 feet by 40 feet and was clad, the interior was clad with a yellow pine wainscoting. Really? Do the cows deserve yellow pine wainscoting? But I guess nothing's too good for Mr. Hershey and his chocolate endeavors. So we found that to be curious that he actually had a cow stable or cow barn in his portfolio. Here's one that some of the audience may remember, and he designed Captain People's skating rink. It was also located at Rocky Springs. In the year 1907, we found a newspaper clipping that said skating and dancing, along with a big brass orchestra, to be held at the People's Bathing Resort Big Skating Rink. It was 660 feet in length. You could traverse that 6 times and have a mile. It was amazing what he was able to pull off in that structure, in that kind of a balloon type structure. Now, I would say the outside wouldn't win any design awards, but that's not what it was about. It was really about providing entertainment for the folks at Rocky Springs. The other curiosity in his portfolio is his association with the famous Woolworth building, which was on the first block of Queen Street in a beautiful Venetian Renaissance style. It was not designed by Mr. Urban. It was designed by a New York City firm. However, Mr. Urban's was in charge of the construction oversight in the year 1899. So he oversaw the entire construction of that gorgeous building that you see on the screen. And curiously, he moved his office into the Woolworth building for over 30 years. His office address was 442 Woolworth building. So he was up on the 4th floor somewhere in that zone with his staff. The other thing that's fascinating that we found in the archives at the museum was a photograph showing Mr. Woolworth sitting there on the left. And on the far right, that is actually C. Emlen Urban. So he is sitting in the audience of Frank W. Woolworth in that large and beautiful 206 office building on North Queen Street. And that photograph had not been identified before as Mr. Urban, but that is clearly him sitting there in that company. I suspect the person standing is Ross Singleton. Ross Singleton was C. Emlen Urban's chief draftsman. He was his right-hand person that did everything that Mr. Urban wasn't doing. I'm sure most of you on the call have been to the Lancaster County Park. At one time, it was called the Williamson Park. It was interesting to discover that the Memorial Gateway that we drive through all the time down at the park was actually the gateway designed by C. Emlen Urban. You can see his name there in the article in the lower left-hand side. And he designed this gateway in honor of Henry Stackhouse Williamson. That's a middle name I love. So Henry Stackhouse Williamson was a merchant and philanthropist in our city for many years. And you can see the bronze plaque indicates his name and his stature and standing in the city. But what I find personally interesting is that Mr. Williamson overlooked Mr. Urban when he wanted his personal mansion designed. Instead of hiring Mr. Urban to design his personal mansion on the west side of town, he went to that young British architect, James H. Warner, to design his personal mansion. Now, I wonder if that's stuck in Mr. Urban's crawl just a little bit. Here's one of these lovely finds on a walk out Chestnut Street. I walk that street a lot, or Orange Street, I should say. And I walk Orange Street quite frequently, and not knowing that I was walking beneath one of C. Emlen Urban's beautiful buildings on that block. It's the 400 block of West Orange Street. And what you're looking at appears to be a rather large, impressive manor house, when in fact it is a duplex. And each duplex is probably 16 to 18 feet wide, not overly large, but he designed it to look like one large manor house using an Edwardian design style with a neo-Baroque look. Now, Mr. Miller ran a drug company in the city of Lancaster and we found out that he and Mr. Urban went to the same church, and they were only 2 years apart in age. And the detailing on Mr. Miller's residence is just spectacular. I encourage you to do your walking this time of year because the trees are without their leaves and you can really get to enjoy what our city has to offer. And even Gap, Pennsylvania, was not spared Mr. Urban's work. Believe it or not, Gap has a beautiful national bank that Mr. Urban designed. When I saw this article, I couldn't believe it. I've seen the bank before. I had suspicion that it had his hand in it because he loves neoclassical revival styles. And it's sitting there for everyone's enjoyment, for everyone to take advantage of some of his work outside the city of Lancaster. The next one caught my attention as well. It's called The Four Grand Houses. This was a newspaper clipping that we found in the year 1901, and you can see the headline is Four Grand Houses, Myers and Rathbone Builders. Well, those two gentlemen are builders of many homes in the city, and here they declare that they've done over 80. But they said the one that they're highlighting in the newspaper was the handsomest of them all. And they're located at 137 to 143 East Clay Street in our city. Walk past them all the time, suspected that Urban may have had a hand in them, but now we know for sure that he did. Just beautifully done in the Spanish Renaissance. And if you look real closely up under those overhangs, you can enjoy beautiful carved festoons with fruit over the arched windows. Just fascinating. And that's why I really encourage everyone to go out and walk and enjoy the architecture that our community has to offer. I think we're unparalleled. This is one of my favorites too, is the Lidditz Springs National Bank. Seen that building? It's located at the intersection of Broad and Main, where the fountain is. I think we knew it was a C. Emlen Urban. And so in looking through the historic archives, we find these early black and white photographs of the bank when he was basically revealing it for the first time in his favored classic revival look. But this is the photograph that really captivated me. I'm looking at this photograph, and to the right of his bank, the Lidditz Springs Bank, to the right, there's this cute little building sitting there, and it caught my attention. So in doing some research, we find out that that is actually the bank that was designed in 1901 by Mr. Urban's favorite friend architect, James H. Warner. So his continual nemesis for 10 years designed a bank right next to the one he wanted to plant. So the next photograph says it all. So you look at that beautiful Italian Renaissance building, and to the far left of that bank, you see there's 5 beautiful tall windows in the arch. Well, Mr. Urban comes along and takes them out of play. You just wonder sometimes, don't you? Now, we all knew that he was involved in the Fulton Opera House in the year 1904. But what we didn't know until we could dig into the newspaper articles and archives is that Mr. Urban was actually very involved in the Fulton Opera House 10 years earlier in the year 1894. The newspaper clipping said there are marked improvements at the new Fulton Hall, including a major interior renovation, including an expanded stage, included expanded seating from 1,000 seat to 1,250 seats. He's only 31 years old. He had never done a theater before in his portfolio, and yet he's rolling out not only in 1894, but the interior that we all enjoy today is the work of C. Emlen Urban. It's just fascinating. We'll highlight this in the book when it comes out next year. This next project is one of those that I literally had to say, are you kidding me? He actually did the Malta Boathouse on Philadelphia Boathouse Row. For any of you that have driven down the Schuylkill Expressway and you go down and you're mesmerized by Boathouse Row, well, how in the world did Mr. Urban end up landing a commission to do the interior of the famous and historic, at that time, 1873 Malta Boathouse? Well, he won the commission and he was only 22 years old when the boat club retained him to redo the interior of their world famous boathouse. I just don't know how this guy did it all and how he did it so well. This is another one of these, let's go for a walk and see what we can find. The J.B. Martin Mansion is located at West Chestnut and Lancaster Avenue. This is the historic photograph taken at the time it was completed. This is one of Mr. Urban's earlier projects in residential Queen Anne. He was a young 27 years old, as you can see here. And today it is the Wolf Museum of Music and Art. And it stands as tall and proud today as it did in the year 1890 when he designed it. So please go check out some what I call high style Queen Anne from head to toe. And now this photograph is a little bit older. It was repainted this summer. So it has a fresh coat of paint everywhere. And it is quite honestly spectacular. Kirk Johnson and C. Emlen Urban were very close friends. But what we didn't know is that their relationship went far beyond what we know them for. Mr. Kirk Johnson commissioned Mr. Urban in the year 1911 to do his music store shown on the screen. Mr. Johnson is highlighted on the right, but that's where we thought their relationship stopped, with the design of that beautiful French Baroque department store. But through newspapers, we were discovered that they were friends long before that. And the fact that Mr. Johnson retained Mr. Urban to design his personal residence at 909 East King Street in the year 1890. No one knew that. And all of a sudden, the newspapers waxed poetic about this incredible mansion that was designed by Mr. Urban for Mr. Johnson. The funny story is, because Mr. Johnson was in the music business, particularly pianos, the sheathing or the cladding on the siding of the building before the shingles went on were piano boxes. So all of the sheathing had piano stamps all over it, as that's what they were doing to save some money. So that building is still out there for your enjoyment. It's right across from the Conestoga Nursing Home. This is one of those that was in that directory that the Preservation Trust provided. The Burley School, big question mark. Was this or was this not a C. Emlen Urban? Well, in fact, this beautiful Spanish revival is in fact a C. Emlen Urban, and he was 34 years old when he designed this beautiful Spanish revival building. And we found this through school board minutes, where they requested him to do the plans for that building. One of my true aha moments of putting this presentation together was what we found on West Chestnut Street. It's actually a public school that sat on Concord. You can see on the left of the screen, Concord and Chestnut Street. There was, in fact, a public school. This was a historic map of the city that we use. And today you walk past that site and it's a beautiful sunset on a lousy parking lot. But what was there when Mr. Urban designed the West Chestnut Street Public School? That's what we're missing today. That is just astronomically cool. What a great building that would have to plug that hole right now. But for whatever reason, it was unfortunately taken down. It was a public school that was really dedicated for that side of the city, for the students that lived there. This is another great find, was the Lancaster Cemetery Gateway, located at Lemon Street where it crosses Lime. There was at one time a beautiful chapel designed by Isaac Hobbs from Philadelphia in 1847. That was removed And in the year 1902, Mr. Urban was given the opportunity to design a new gateway into the cemetery, and he did it in his favorite style, Beaux-Art. So we found that in the newspaper clippings, and the folks that operate the cemetery were just ecstatic to know that in fact Urban was the architect. They suspected he was, but they weren't sure. We had no proof until now. Just to show you some of the diversity of Mr. Urban's depth and breadth of his work and his ability, I found this to be interesting. Pine Street row homes. We found a newspaper clipping in the year 1896 that's identified as the cheapest houses in the city. I'm not sure that's a grand title, but it sure does explain what's going on. These were very inexpensive houses in the city, but you also look down into that clipping, you can see the name C. Emlen Urban pops up. Again, it's not Cassius, it's C. Emlen Urban pops up as offering these very inexpensive, but very well done and very thoughtful row homes. They all sold like hotcakes. Apparently, there was only one of the 7 left when they ran that ad, but there's really nothing cheap about the row homes. The dormers are very articulated. The porches are in many cases still the original porches from the year 1896. What also interesting was the Zion Lutheran steeple. This is on Vine Street, and I did not know that the original church, designed by Edwin Forrest Durang from Philadelphia, did not have a crown. You can see on that historic photograph, there's no top. Well, Mr. Urban was commissioned in 1894 to put the top on. I mean, he was doing everything from cow barns to steeple tops to mansions. In 1916, we found a newspaper caricature of Mr. Urban. And this was a real treat because what they were doing was highlighting him through the Red Rose City Leader. The newspaper would highlight important people in our community over a period of time, and they chose Mr. Urban. And what I was struck by is what he's wearing. That we would call that a drafting smock. Back at that period of time, draftsmen and architects would wear either a drafting apron or a smock so that they would be able to protect their clothing from the ink and the graphite and the smudges. We also learned that he was an avid fisherman. And there was a newspaper story that said he caught the largest fish ever caught in the Susquehanna. It was a bass. He also designed for the Lancaster County Fairgrounds. He did an exhibition hall and a beautiful grandstand. The last project we're going to cover before we conclude is one we all know, but none of us knew who the actual architect or designer of the Liberty House was. The Liberty House is the cute little reproduction of the courthouse that at one time sat where Watt and Shand sat and where the conference center sits today. It was called the Liberty House, designed in the year 1918, and it was designed to sell war bonds. It was 36 feet tall, and it actually raised $12 million. What we learned was the clock was an active clock that every $1 million they earned, they would move the hand 1 tick. So they wanted to move $12 million. It went from 12 back to 12. And then they basically at that time completed their goal. But it was a great representation of the original courthouse that you see on this rendering. So C. Emlen Urban shrank it down. And we all know that that replica now resides at Buchanan Park, and it houses volleyballs and soccer balls and things like that. As Urban was coming to the end of his career, as he was aging and getting into his later years, I like to say that he reverted back to his comfort food. He reverted back to his grilled cheese sandwich. And I think we learned through observing his work that as he got older and maybe had less energy, that his later work all appeared to be what we call 5 Bay Georgian revival. That was his bread and butter. That was his comfort food. Even his own personal residence that he designed in the year 1914 was a 5 Bay Georgian revival. As he highlighted this for J.D. Glenn out on the west side of town. This is for He designed this for Ralph Hall in the year 1933. And then I got a phone call one day from the owner of what was the John Swanger residence. And they said, we live in a C. Emlen Urban house. I said, do you really? How do you know? And they said, we have his drawings. Well, I skedaddled out to the west side of town, and sure enough, the homeowners rolled out this beautiful set of blueprints, as you can see here, and they are in fact C. Emlen Urban's 1933. This is probably one of his last projects. He became ill in his later years. He didn't practice from the year, he died in 1939, May 22nd to be exact, but he stopped practicing about 2 to 3 years prior to that, just didn't have the health. He was ill for a good 2 years. He died in the house that he designed in 1927, as highlighted here. This is also out in the Buchanan Park, right next to the house that he designed in 1914. He is buried at the Greenwood Cemetery, as shown here. And what I also found interesting, for the portfolio of work that he was able to amass in his 50 years of practice, his tombstone is so understated, beautifully done, but incredibly understated. And at the very bottom of the tombstone, inscribed in stone, it says, from Solomon, until the day break and the shadows flee away. And the head markers basically identify he and his wife and his children, beautifully done in the Greenwood Cemetery. So that concludes my chatter for tonight. I hope I didn't exhaust you, but we had a lot of things to share, and hope you enjoyed our chat this evening. I would welcome questions if I only know how to stop sharing the screen. Let's see if I can. Did I do it?
I think you may have.
Okay, and I'll put myself on a
Let me
video.
see here, full screen. There you go. You did
Are we
it.
on?
We are on. Wow, till the day breaks and the shadows fall away.
How about that?
What a great quote. And just the simple last name, Urban, on the stone.
That says it all, doesn't it, Tom?
Yeah. Yeah, Greg, thank you so much. It was wonderful.
welcome.
We've got a few questions here, although we're open to more questions, so please send them in right now as you can. One of our first questions, Greg, is about the Hamilton Club or the
Yes.
Catherine Long House. Do we know whether or not Urban had a hand in that house?
We know for a fact that the Catherine Long / Hamilton Club was designed by the British architect James H. Warner, who he arrived in town. He was only in town, Tom, about 10 months when he received the commission from Catherine Long to design the Hamilton Club. I'll call it the Hamilton Club. That's how we know it today. So yes, it's interesting that Mr. Urban was in full throttle as Lancaster's preeminent architect in 1890, but yet Catherine Long commissioned the British architect to design the Chateau-esque mansion. So I don't know the answer why that happened, but I'm sure it probably didn't sit real well with Mr. Urban.
Yeah, probably not. And as you've mentioned, they had a bit of an ongoing
They had an
competition.
11-year love affair,
Right.
so to speak.
So how about Urban's contribution in terms of helping to develop other architects? Are there any acolytes? You mentioned one who did all of his drawings. Did his creative legacy pass on, as far as you know, to any particular individuals?
As far as I know, well, Ross Singleton, as I mentioned, standing in that photograph, was his right-hand person. And Ross Singleton, in later city directories, shows up as an architect in the city. So, in fact, he did carry on some of C. Emlen Urban's work. Henry Schaub is another Lancaster architect who is 20 years younger than Mr. Urban. And we know that Mr. Schaub took over some of Mr. Urban's commissions in his later years. So there's an overlap of clients that they worked for. We know very, very little about the size of staff that Mr. Urban had to produce that much work. We just can't find anything. Once in a while, in a newspaper story, it'll make reference to so-and-so attended the meeting with Mr. Urban. at his side taking notes or whatever. So we just can't find any records of his payroll or folks. Sometimes the city directories will indicate, in the old days, they would actually say a draftsman for somebody. It would say a draftsman for Mr. Urban.
Yeah. You mentioned Schaub, and of course, there are a number of buildings in town, and I don't want to shift it too much from Urban to Schaub, but there are some remarkable buildings of a style that Urban rarely, if ever, worked in.
Yeah, Mr. Urban, from what I can tell, wasn't real enamored with Art Deco. He never really got on board with Art Deco. But if you remember back, the first project I showed you this evening, the General Tire Company, I did a close-up photograph of a detail on the wall with chevrons. And that was glazed terracotta tile. Now that was the beginning of sort of the Art Deco movement. And that photograph and the building was 1930, which was in, the throes of Art Deco. So Urban tinkered a little bit with Art Deco, but he never got on board 100% like Henry Schaub did, for instance.
Do we know whether or not Urban had any hand in the design of the Kuiper Long mansion, the former Mary Sachs store on North Duke Street?
We had no evidence of him being the architect of that beautiful mansion.
One of the things that you mentioned early on in your presentation is how many styles he worked in, more than 20 styles, and how many clients he had, the variety of clients, from cow barns to roller rinks and so forth. When you think about a city the size of Lancaster and an architect who works in such a great variety of styles and a great variety of clients, do you think this is typical of a good architect in a community across America at this time? Or do you think this is a bit exceptional?
I think it's exceptional, without a doubt. It's exceptional. Even when I think about architects today, Tom, I don't know that I know of any architects in today's world that have this sort of the energy and the velocity. I mean, he was pumping high octane before it was invented. I mean, I don't know when the man ever slept. What everyone needs to keep in mind with Mr. Urban is, at the same time, he was doing this massive portfolio of commissions in our community. He was also doing all of the work for Milton Hershey in the city and town of Hershey. He did all of the major commissions that you see in the town of Hershey, including residences. So he was doing Lancaster, he was doing Hershey. He also did silk mills in North Carolina, silk mills in Virginia. He worked in New York. He worked in Connecticut. He was all over the place. And keep in mind, this was all before modern transportation.
Yeah, right.
In 1885, we didn't have automobiles. How did he get from here to there? How was he doing it? It just amazes me how he was able to accomplish that, and without computers.
Yeah, my sense,
without fax, and without cell phones.
I think he was a bit of an architectural savant in the sense that he could absorb the very particularities of styles across time and find ways to parcel them out in this city, so that we have, I mean, normally I think you'd go into a city the size of Lancaster and you might see a variety of styles, but they might come from 12 different architects.
And where you out?
They all seem to be coming from this funnel of Urban. So to switch things to a kind of more modest building, a one-story building now housing building character in the 300 block of North Queen Street was designed by Urban, according to our questioner. And according to the blueprint provided by the Historical Commission some years ago, did Urban design many other utilitarian structures? You mentioned cow barns and things. Are there other strictly utilitarian buildings you can think of? Yes,
he did let's see, he could be credited for doing the first mid-rise building in our city for the Moss, M-O-S-S, Moss. He did the Moss Cigar Factory on Lemon and Prince. And he did that early on in his career. That was highlighted in his first 10-year booklet that he put out. Here's the work I've done in 10 years. And he actually highlights, something as mundane as a tobacco warehouse in the city of Lancaster. Yes, he did everything from, one-story warehouses for the Lancaster Storage Company, did tobacco warehouses. He did it all from big to little, and he could expand and contract his mind. That's the thing that impresses me, Tom, is how he could change gears very quickly to do the sophistication that it takes to design a 15-story skyscraper when you're not even trained to do those. And he only did one. It's just mind-boggling.
Yeah. So do we know much about him outside of the role of architect in the community? Did he serve in any social capacities or any governmental engagements that you know, or church-related, community-related? Anything on that?
Well, he was a member of the First Methodist Church. Now, he was not the architect of the church they ultimately attended, but he did renovations to it. He certainly enjoyed the American Institute of Architects. There's a lot of newspaper clippings. We find him at, we call them AIA, American Institute of Architects, AIA meetings in Harrisburg and York and in Lancaster. So he's very active in that. I was surprised, quite honestly, Tom, that he was not elevated to a fellow. Edwin, that he practiced with up in Scranton, was a fellow of the AIA. Henry Shaw was a fellow of the AIA, but he was never advanced to it. Now, that always was a curiosity to me.
Do you know if he had any comments about work with regard to the St. James Parish House or your work in the St. I know that you have used that as a kind of a study hall. He
designed the St. James Parish House. That was his largest example of Georgian revival, and designed that in the year 1903. And I'm very fortunate to actually have my office on the 3rd floor of that parish house. And I kind of get a kick thinking that, maybe Mr. Urban was actually in this office at one time, maybe just inspecting parts of the architecture or the construction that was on. But it's a real treat and pleasure and joy for me to be in a building that he designed.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I want to thank our audience. There's so many great questions coming in. I'm trying to keep up with them as best I can. So, Greg, I'm sure you say you walk West Orange Street, 430 West Orange, which was the home of the American Red Cross for a while. Originally designed for Henry Wolson around 1904. Do you know what style that building is?
That's Georgian. That's a Georgian revival as well. Beautifully done. It was recently repainted. It was, as I recall, that's in one of his favorite building colors and materials, which is not one of my favorites.
No, that kind of yellowish.
Emlen Urban was absolutely, he was smitten, beyond smitten, with narrow gauge gold Roman brick. So whenever you walking the streets of Lancaster and you see a gold brick, which is very thin and very narrow, I'll bet chances are Emlen Urban had a hand in it. 9 times out of 10.
Yeah. So here's a question from an individual. My grandfather, who was general contractor Alexander L. Gerhardt, partnered with Urban in the early 1930s in the design of the Ephrata High School on Highland Avenue. It was designed to be built in 5 stages into the 1950s. This individual's grandfather was known for overbuilding his structures. I'll mention this individual has a German last name, and you can go back to the 17th and 18th century. Germans overbuilt and over-engineered buildings even back then, so there's a long tradition. The structure's now in elementary school, it's still standing, but the detailed interior is gone. Are you familiar with this building?
Oh my gosh, yes. I highlighted that building in my second to last newspaper column when I was highlighting Egyptian revival architecture, which really seems out of context in Lancaster County. What are we doing with pyramids and sphinxes here? But in fact, that high school has a lot of references to Egyptian architecture. So it's a very rare example of that style.
Okay, so we'll try and get 2 more questions in here. First, there's a Tudor house on the corner of South Broad and 4th Street in Lidditz, rumored to be an Urban house. I don't know whether you are familiar with that building.
I know it well.
You do? Do you think it's Urban? Or do we know if it is?
I would say it's 98% urban. I don't have the proof. The reason I say it, you can compare it to the tutor that he did on Buchanan Avenue in Lancaster,
Mhm.
and it is a one-to-one knockoff. And that's before we had photocopiers. So it's a one-to-one knockoff. The only exception is one of the quadrifoils. They reversed the location of the quadrifoils, which is a decorative element on the front facade.
Mhm.
I don't know what happened. I don't know if Mr. Wilson transplanted it up in Lidditz thinking that no one would see it back here in Lancaster. I don't know, but it has to have a curious story to it.
Well, did those in that day, did those folks from Lidditz ever come into the big city?
It's scary.
You wonder. So I've got one more question, then I'm going to end with a comment. Do you think you've recovered Urban's entire portfolio, or are you expecting more to come to your attention?
Now, what kind of question is that, Tom? Really? You know the answer. Do I have to bring up that photograph of me digging in the sand?
No, you don't.
We're always digging, we're always looking, we're always questioning what's next, what else are we going to find? But there are, I mean, quite honestly, Tom, there are many very talented architects in our community historically, but none of them come even close to generating the portfolio and diversity of work that Mr. Urban did. We are so fortunate to have him author so many buildings that we can enjoy today. Granted, many have been taken down. Unfortunately, the building I live in is actually sitting on what was the gravesite of a beautiful church that he designed in our city. But that's, that's the way it goes.
So between your two lectures on Urban, most recently with us, you've now more than doubled the number of commissions from the prior lecture. It'd be interesting to see how many you come up with when you give us part 3 of See Emlen Urban.
Tell you what, Tom, I'm only going to do part 3 if I can do it live.
And we'll make that happen. I have one final comment, and that is you showed us a house either on East Clay or East New Street. I'm not sure that he purchased, right, and lived in
141 New, East New,
and raised to a 3rd level.
Yes.
When you look at the top, the crest of that 3rd level, there's ornamentation there that I have never seen on any house that's been raised from 2 to 3 stories.
Well,
I think that is exactly
that's got to be Urban. Only he would go overboard.
It's almost like a signature. It really is.
I mean, and what's interesting, Tom, if you look at that house carefully, you can see the line of demarcation. He couldn't quite match the brick between the 2nd and the 3rd floor.
Well, he can't be perfect. So, Greg, I just want to thank you so much for this incredibly enlightening conversation. We hope you continue to keep your head in the sand and dig as much information as you can to expand our knowledge of this remarkable individual that really, frankly, enlivens our experience of Lancaster every time we walk into the city or walk around the city. So I want to thank you so much. I also want to thank everyone who attended this evening. Once again, upon leaving this Zoom, a window is going to pop up. It's a post-event survey. It's completely voluntary, but we'd love to know your thoughts about the program tonight. We'll also be posting a recording of this presentation on YouTube in the upcoming days, so stay tuned for that. And as earlier mentioned, you can register for the December colloquium, The Music of Ephrata Cloister, with Grammy nominee Christopher Dylan Herbert. Just go to our website and you'll find the location for that. Finally, at midnight tonight, the Lancaster County Community Foundation's Extraordinary Give begins and lasts for 24 hours until midnight Friday. We encourage you to support the community benefit organizations whose mission stirs your passion. And we certainly hope that Lancaster History is one of those. Go to www.extragive.org and look for Lancaster History. Thank you. Have a great night. Again, Greg, thank you.
Tom, I want to thank you for rescuing me from drowning at the beginning of this program. I couldn't find my way through this computer stuff.
You swam beautifully, and we thank
I bobbed up to the top again. Thank you.
And we thank Emily Miller behind the scenes.
And Emily. Yeah.
Good evening, folks, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving celebration. We have a lot to be thankful for. Good night.
Good night.